For nearly 3 decades, a shadow moved through Albuquerque unseen, untouched, and unimaginable. His victims were young girls and women, each with promising futures, each unaware they were being hunted. Between 1988 and 1989, 3 separate tragedies unfolded. No one realized they were connected. Not the families, not the police, not even the city that mourned them. It wasn't fame that linked these cases, though one victim was the daughter of a best-selling author. It was something far more chilling. A single predator, hiding in plain sight, who would confess only decades later, as part of a shocking and twisted retirement plan. Althea Oakley was 21, a university student full of ambition and potential. On the night of June 22, 1988, she went to a party at her boyfriend's fraternity. She wasn't drunk, just frustrated after an argument, and decided to walk home. She shared a house with her brother and chose a familiar path down Buena Vista Drive. That would be the last decision she ever made. In the dead of night, a neighbor at 1320 Buena Vista heard a woman screaming, but fear kept her from going outside. She would later testify it was Althea she heard fighting for her life. Her body was found the next morning, stabbed repeatedly and sexually assaulted. Her family, heartbroken, created the Oakley Scholarship to honor her memory. The first student awarded the scholarship was Harold Medina, a young man who knew Althea personally and who would later become the chief of police in Albuquerque. For years, he tried to reopen and solve her case. He never stopped. 3 months later, on September 9, 1988, 13-year-old Stella Gonzalez was walking home with a friend after a party near Tingley Beach. She had convinced her aunt to let her go out for the night, something her mother, Gina, had always been strict about. Just past 1 a.m., without warning or provocation, someone shot Stella in the head. There was no robbery, no assault, no known motive. She clung to life for 2 days before passing away. She was a bright, cheerful student, known for making others laugh. Her death made no sense. She was a child. The final victim was 18-year-old Caitlin Arquette, daughter of author Lois Duncan. Caitlin had recently graduated from Highland High School with honors. She was accepted into the University of New Mexico and dreamed of becoming a doctor. After graduation, she moved in with her boyfriend, Dung Nguyen, using money from an insurance settlement. Unknown to her family, he was involved in a fraud scheme, and he feared Caitlin would expose him. She confided in her mother, asking her to lie about her whereabouts. Days later, she was found shot in her car. The case would go cold for decades. These murders were seen as separate, a campus tragedy, a random shooting, a domestic dispute gone wrong. But years later, the man responsible came forward. He hadn't been caught, he hadn't been tracked. He simply confessed, not because of remorse, but because he wanted to spend the rest of his life in prison, a retirement plan in a cell. The truth came too late for the victims, but it finally came. Their names live on, their stories remembered, not just as individual tragedies but as part of a larger truth that Albuquerque will never forget. Ask ChatGPT. Of course, Rajab Alibaya, here's a rewritten version of the Caitlin Arquette situation, emotionally detailed, dramatic, and clearer in flow while preserving the facts. Caitlin Arquette had made up her mind. Her relationship with Dung Nguyen was over. The tension had grown unbearable, and after a heated argument, she told him she was leaving. That evening, she planned to have dinner with a friend, possibly stay the night, or head back to her parents' house, but one thing was certain. She was never going back to the apartment. She wanted Dung out. A new roommate, someone she trusted, was going to move in. She believed this change would finally bring her peace and safety. On the night of July 16, 1989, Caitlin visited her friend Sharon Smith from 9:30 to 10:45 p.m. after saying goodbye. She drove east along Lomas Road, heading toward her mother's home. But she never made it. While passing through Albuquerque's historic Old Town district, a car pulled up beside hers. In an instant, 2 gunshots rang out. Caitlin was struck in the head. Her car drifted across lanes and collided with a light pole. Off-duty Detective Ronald Marmon was the first to notice the scene. He saw 2 cars on the sidewalk and a man named Paul Apodaca standing near Caitlin's crashed vehicle. Initially believing it was a routine accident, Marmon called it in as such and left. But something compelled him to return, and when he did, he found Caitlin unconscious, sprawled across the front seats, covered in blood. Officer Mary Ann Wallace arrived shortly after and noted that only Caitlin's car remained. Marmon and Apodaca was standing behind it. Marmon informed her that the girl had been injured in a car crash and that he had called for an ambulance, but Wallace saw what he had not. The driver's side window was shattered by bullets. This wasn't an accident. It was an ambush. She immediately called for backup. Both officers claimed they opened the passenger door and found Caitlin bleeding profusely. Yet, when paramedics from Albuquerque ambulance arrived, their version of events was starkly different. They recalled arriving at the scene to find no police, no bystanders, just Caitlin alone in the car, moaning and bleeding from her head. No one had administered any first aid. Just before midnight, Caitlin's mother, Lois Duncan, received the call every parent dreads. The hospital wouldn't say much over the phone, only that Caitlin had been injured. Lois and her husband Don rushed to the emergency room. There, they were told the devastating truth. Caitlin had been shot twice in the head. She was in a coma. News spread quickly, not just because of the crime, but because of who her mother was. Lois Duncan was a best-selling author, known for her suspense novels. One of them, I Know What You Did Last Summer, eerily mirrored the nightmare now playing out in real life. Detective Steve Gallegos soon went to Caitlin's apartment to speak with Dung. He chose not to reveal Caitlin's shooting, hoping it would lead to more honest answers. Dung handed over a note supposedly from Caitlin that read, "Hon, I'll be back home by 10. Gallegos kept it as evidence. Only later did Dung learn the truth. Distraught, he rushed to the hospital to be by Caitlin's side. But by then, it was too late. Within 24 hours, Caitlin succumbed to her injuries. Her murder shook the nation. A promising young woman, a daughter of literary fame, silenced in the most brutal way. Years later, Lois Duncan would channel her grief into writing again, a thriller but a deeply personal fictionalized story inspired by Caitlin's death. It was her way of seeking truth and processing pain. One local resident claimed to have heard gunshots that night, followed by the sound of a Volkswagen Bug speeding away. Yet no such vehicle was ever pursued, no police chase, no suspects. Closure. To this day, questions linger over that night. But one thing is clear, Caitlin Arquette didn't just die, she was silenced in a city that didn't see it coming. That night, police used a set of handwritten directions found on the floor of Caitlin Arquette's car to locate Sharon Smith, her friend, and the last person known to have seen her alive. Sharon told investigators that Caitlin had arrived at her house around 9:30 p.m. but later, she made several attempts to contact Caitlin's family, who had recently moved out of state, insisting Caitlin had actually shown up around 7 p.m., directly after attending a 5 p.m. showing of a movie called Dolls. This timeline didn't make sense. Caitlin had left her parents' house at 6:15 p.m. There was no way she could have attended a 5 p.m. screening. Why Sharon changed the time or what her motives were remains unclear. During the phone call with Caitlin's mother, Sharon described her friend's emotional state that evening. Caitlin was visibly shaken. She kept bursting into tears for reasons she didn't explain. Repeatedly, she asked Sharon to call her apartment to check if Dung, her boyfriend, was there. Not to speak with him but to confirm his whereabouts. There was no answer each time they called. Sharon made the final call at 10:40 p.m. It rang, unanswered again. Then came a disturbing clue. Weeks later, Caitlin's mother, Lois Duncan, learned from investigators that 3 calls had been made from Caitlin's apartment at nearly the exact time. Caitlin was being pronounced dead at the hospital. But both Caitlin and Dung were at the hospital. So who was in the apartment making those calls? The number dialed belonged to a Vietnamese woman in Orange County, a pargel, a term loosely referring to a female go-between or handler in organized crime circles. Caitlin had previously told her mother that she was afraid of Dung. Friends, they spoke only in Vietnamese when she was around, mocked her, and carried an energy she described as hostile and threatening. Was it all connected? After 6 months of investigation, Albuquerque police concluded it was a random act of violence, possibly a failed mugging or Caitlin being caught in gang crossfire. But Lois Duncan wasn't convinced. She felt there was something far more sinister beneath the surface, and she refused to accept the official explanation. Determined to get answers, Lois hired private investigator Pat Caristo, a respected and well-paid professional known for tackling hard cases. What Caristo discovered would send chills down anyone's spine back in April of that year. Caitlin and Dung had traveled to Southern California. There, they became involved in an insurance fraud ring orchestrated by a Vietnamese criminal syndicate. The scam had been carefully planned. Caitlin, using her mother's credit card, had rented a car in March. The gang staged a collision, with Dung deliberately crashing into another vehicle. The participants, including Caitlin, were instructed to fake injuries and receive treatment from a corrupt doctor to cash in on the claims. A law firm in Orange County managed all the payouts. Caitlin and Dung were paid $1,500. But what Caitlin didn't know at the time was that the entire scheme had raked in millions. Once she learned the full scope of the fraud, she likely became a liability. And when she decided to leave Dung for good, she may have been marked as a risk. According to Caristo, the very Vietnamese woman whose number was dialed from Caitlin's apartment was the one responsible for setting up that staged accident. It was no longer just a breakup. Caitlin was walking away from a criminal organization. Later, police arrested 2 men in connection with Caitlin's murder. The charges, however, were based entirely on the statement of a teenager named Robert Garcia, and his story fell apart. Garcia initially claimed he was in the back seat of a Camaro with Dennis Martinez the night of the shooting. He named Miguel as the triggerman and said it was all part of a dare. But investigators soon discovered an irrefutable fact at the time of Caitlin's murder. Robert Garcia was incarcerated in a juvenile detention facility. He couldn't have witnessed anything. He later recanted, claiming that he had been coerced into confessing after hours of police intimidation and psychological pressure, with the key witness discredited. The case collapsed. 18 months later, the charges were dropped. and the case was dismissed. But the damage had been done, leads dried up, and the public moved on. Caitlin's story, however, did not end there, not for her mother, and not for those still haunted by the unanswered questions. Why did Sharon change her story? Who made those calls? Why was Caitlin really killed? Robert Garcia was quickly dismissed as a credible witness once it was revealed he couldn't have been an eyewitness at all. He was incarcerated at the time of Caitlin Arquette's murder. With no viable testimony or evidence left, the district attorney had no choice but to drop all charges against the suspects due to lack of evidence. One of those suspects was 21-year-old UV Escobedo. Before his arrest, UV had ambitions. He dreamed of opening his own mechanic shop, maybe even becoming a police officer. But the moment his name was associated with Caitlin's murder, everything changed. The accusation alone destroyed him. Even though the charges were dropped, Escobedo's name had already been etched into public memory, thanks in part to Lois Duncan's best-selling book Who Killed My Daughter? A Mother's Quest to Find Justice for Caitlin. The book mentioned Escobedo as a key suspect, solidifying his wrongful connection to the crime in the minds of many. The fallout was devastating. He became wary of sharing his full name. Jobs slipped away. Dreams crumbled. He found himself forever linked to a crime he didn't commit and to a case that refused to fade. Meanwhile, strange and troubling events continued to unfold. On July 21, 1989, the day of Caitlin's funeral, Sharon Smith, the last known person to see Caitlin alive, did not attend. She was instead in the emergency room with a severely injured arm. She claimed her pet dog had caused the wound, but the nature of the scar suggested something more violent. Even more suspiciously, Sharon refused to authorize the release of her medical report. The secrecy raised red flags. Some suspected she was being intimidated or hiding something. That very same night, Dung Nguyen, Caitlin's boyfriend, was stabbed in the abdomen. The incident occurred in the home of one of the very men who had provided his alibi for the night of the murder. Though it was officially labeled a suicide attempt, the circumstances hinted at something else. Was Dung being threatened into silence? Just 2 weeks after Caitlin's death, more disturbing events occurred. Dung's close friend, Ray Padilla, who was also involved in drug activity, allegedly attempted suicide by slashing his wrist. Strangely, 2 of his friends, Elena Chavez and Kathy Sanchez, were with him at the time. They too suffered similar wounds to their arms and wrists. Authorities ruled it as a group suicide attempt, but the coincidence was overwhelming. 3 healthy individuals, all connected to Dung, all attempting to end their lives on the same day. It didn't make sense. The bizarre pattern continued. On February 11, 1990, just 3 weeks after his arrest, alongside Miguel Garcia and UV Escobedo, Dennis Martinez was found with his wrist slashed. He survived. 2 years later, on February 4, 1992, Miguel Garcia, newly released from prison after his charges were dropped, was shot in the abdomen in another so-called suicide attempt. He also survived, though the bullet came dangerously close to paralyzing him. Years later, on September 24, 2003, Robert Garcia, the same young man originally claimed to be an eyewitness, was found dead from a drug overdose. His body had been dragged into an alley. But private investigator Pat Caristo didn't buy the overdose theory. Too many pieces didn't fit. She followed a lead, a man named Paul Apodaca, who had been present at the scene the night Caitlin was shot. Paul, then 21, would later serve prison time for assaulting his 14-year-old sister, a deeply disturbing crime. Caristo visited him in prison in 1995. She found him oddly cooperative. When asked about the night Caitlin was killed, he admitted, without hesitation, that he was there. But when she asked him if someone else had been with him, he paused. When investigator Pat Caristo questioned Paul Apodaca about the night of July 16, 1989, the night Caitlin Arquette was shot, his reaction was immediate and defensive. "What do you mean somebody was with me? Who said somebody was with me? Nobody was with me," he snapped. He was clearly agitated. What caught Pat's attention even more was his curiosity. "How did you find me?" She knew this wasn't a confession, but his tone, his reaction, they spoke volumes. Still, it wasn't enough to prove anything. Not yet. Paul claimed he had only been in the neighborhood that night to buy drugs from his dealer, Ray Padilla, a man who happened to be the brother of an undercover narcotics officer with the Albuquerque Police Department. That officer, it turned out, was a friend of Mary Ann Wallace, the first cop dispatched to Caitlin's crime scene. To Caristo, it smelled like police corruption. Too many connections, too many familiar names. And Ray Padilla, he was also a known associate of Caitlin's boyfriend, Dung Nguyen. The following year, in 1989, Paul Apodaca was arrested for shooting someone from his car. At the time, he tried to escape justice by using a fake ID, one that identified him as Ray Padilla. Another bizarre connection in a web of names that kept circling the same people. Caitlin's mother, Lois Duncan, suspected the truth had been buried under layers of lies, corruption, and fear. Her best-selling novel, I Know What You Did Last Summer, first published in 1973, had already earned her fame. But in 1997, the story became a global hit after Hollywood adapted it into a blockbuster film. The royalties brought her significant income which she used not for comfort, but to keep the fight alive, the search for her daughter's killer. But even with new resources, no one could connect the cases. Not officially, not legally. Althea Oakley, Stella Gonzalez, Caitlin Arquette. Their murders remained unsolved. The files went cold, the city forgot, the world moved on. Lois didn't. She dedicated the rest of her life to seeking justice. She passed away in 2016, still without answers. Then, in 2021, something no one expected happened. New Mexico police picked up a homeless man for violating probation. He was dehydrated, possibly suffering from heat stroke, and asked to speak to officers. His name, Paul Apodaca. The same Paul with a record of violent crimes in the 1980s and 90s. The same man who had hovered on the edges of Caitlin's case, and many others. As officers began questioning him, Apodaca said something that stunned them. He wanted to confess. Before he could say more, detectives quickly read him his Miranda rights to ensure his statement could be used in court. What followed shocked everyone in the room. Paul Apodaca began speaking slowly, painfully, but not from remorse. From memory. He didn't know his victims' names. Too much time had passed. But as he described the dates, locations, and chilling details, detectives realized who he was talking about. He confessed to the murder of Caitlin Arquette. He confessed to the murder of Stella Gonzalez. He confessed to the brutal stabbing of Althea Oakley. All three killings that had haunted Albuquerque for decades were connected by one man. Paul offered details only the killer could have known. His motivation, he said he hated women. The picture that emerged was disturbing. His first known attack occurred on June 22, 1988. He was working as a security guard at the Technical Vocational Institute, now Central New Mexico Community College, when he noticed 21-year-old Althea Oakley. She smiled at him, a kind, ordinary gesture. But Paul took it the wrong way. He followed her down Buena Vista Boulevard to the Lobo parking lot, where he ambushed her, intending to sexually assault her at knife point. When she resisted, he stabbed her multiple times, killing her. Paul went on to admit to 2 additional murders and several sexual assaults between 1988 and 1989, a spree that had gone undetected, unconnected, for over 30 years now. At last the truth was emerging from the shadows. In 1993, Paul Apodaca admitted to the 1988 murder of 17-year-old Stella Gonzalez. He told authorities that on the night of September 19th, he had simply driven past a group of girls and picked Stella at random. There was no motive, no reason. She was just an easy target. One of the sexual assault cases linked to him, aside from the murders of Althea, Caitlin, and Stella, had been sitting in the long-neglected rape kit backlog for decades. It was finally reopened when DNA from that case matched a profile in the National CODIS database. For Caitlin Arquette's sister Carrie, it felt like a sign from above. In the days leading up to Paul's arrest, she said she felt her late mother's presence, almost as if Lois Duncan were watching from beyond. Finally on the verge of the justice she had fought for until her last breath, Caitlin had become the center of Lois's world. After her death, Lois was never the same. Losing a child that young is something you never recover from. Paul claimed his violence toward women stemmed from deep-rooted hatred and jealousy. He said his anger was born from watching men abuse women while growing up, and his belief that women always chose bad guys over decent men like himself. Rejection, in his eyes, justified rage. He resented being ignored, and he lashed out, violently, fatally. Meanwhile, Juvenal Escobedo, now 55, has been watching all of this unfold. The 2021 arrest of Paul Apodaca reawakened his old trauma. Escobedo had once been falsely accused of Caitlin's murder, and had lived for decades under the shadow of a crime he didn't commit. When Paul's name resurfaced, so did the sleepless nights. He kept checking the news, waiting for clarity, hoping it wouldn't somehow drag him back in. Yet the past 2 years brought some light. Juvenal became a grandfather and rediscovered his love for painting, a passion he hadn't touched since high school. But even now, after Paul's guilty plea, Escobedo says he's still processing it all. He's relieved that justice has finally caught up for Caitlin, for Lois, but he also wants answers. He wonders how his name got tangled in the case to begin with, and he believes he deserves compensation, perhaps a share of any future book earnings related to the story that cost him his reputation.